Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. I'm Heather Burnt-Santee, momentarily thrown because I didn't get the voice that said this is going to be recording. Usually that startles me, and now I'm startled because it didn't happen. Anyway, welcome to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. My guest today is Amanda Morgan. Hi, Amanda.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, some of you may be familiar with Amanda from her Not Just Cute work, but Amanda, tell folks what you want them to know about you.
Yeah, so I started Not Just Cute. The name kind of says it all. It goes back to when I was teaching at the university doing my graduate work. I had a graduate teaching assistantship, and my friend and I, who she also had a teaching assistantship, we would sit in our little closet of an office and talk about these meetings that we would have with student teachers and how often the word cute came up when they would talk about what they had planned, and just helping them understand that cute is fine. A lot of what we do does end up being cute, but cute is not a developmental objective, and children deserve so much more than a cute experience in early childhood. And so that's a lot of where my work stems out of, helping educators to understand, but also helping them to articulate to others that the work that we do is not just cute, it's really powerful and intentional. And when we see that, we're able to serve children better. And when we help others to see that, they're able to partner with us a lot better in building strong communities for young children to recognize that we're not just keeping them busy, we're not just entertaining them, but these things that maybe look really simple and maybe look really cute are really powerful, intentional things that are really supporting strong development for young children.
Yeah. Before I had my own podcast, I was a guest on a podcast, and just sort of organically from the conversation said, we've got to get beyond the cute. And that just sort of was like and then I found you like really close. Like, maybe I stole it from her. Maybe
I think it's a common thought. Common thought.
Yeah, but we just have to be able to, the cute is fine. I'm all for a cute, funny story. But there's an element too that is sort of tends towards a dehumanized view of the children.
Absolutely.
Too, if that's what we're really focused on. So specifically, for this episode, we're going to talk about the science of reading, capital letters, science.
The capital letters.
It's not quite a product or a packaged curriculum yet, but we have to distinguish that we're not just talking about the research that tells us about it. We're talking about this program, this kind of school of thought of the science of reading. And I mentioned before we started recording, the reason this is really interesting to me right now is because I'm in Indiana, and Indiana has just passed a law, and maybe other states are too, that says our test scores for reading are really bad. We're not happy with that. So the new law is that all schools have to use science of reading research and tools and the framework. And so then all colleges who teach teachers have to include instruction on the science of reading. So I'm trying to learn.
You're right.
Learn about it. So just as a kind of an opening quote, just because that's the thing we do on the show, you've got a blog post about the science of reading that came out not too long ago. And the very first piece is you wrote, "I'm passionate about intentional whole child development, and I love to nerd out." Yay, me too. Tell me you have some science about how children learn and grow, and I am all in for a deep dive. So when I dove into the all capitals science of reading, I thought there were a few things that could be clarified, especially when it comes to our youngest learners. So can you do like a summary of what we're talking about when we talk about the science of reading?
Yeah. And I want to be clear, I'm not, this big expert on science of reading. Like you mentioned in the quote, I am kind of a generalist. I'm really passionate about early childhood and whole child development. And so I feel like what my strength is diving in, nerding out, like you said, and like you like to do, nerding out and deep diving and making connections to the whole, the larger picture of whole child development. And so
I wanted to make sure that we both were able, because you wrote this too, neither of us is opposed to it.
Right. And I started right out there because I think it becomes one of those really polarizing things. And so what I say is this is a yes and. So to start with, just for those who are just starting with what is science of reading. So here's my understanding of it. So, there have been a lot of different perspectives on how children learn how to read. And in about 2000, there was a national reading panel where they took a lot of the science and the research and did a meta-analysis and a really rigorous look at how children learn to read. And they put together this report. Well, you fast forward to about 2018, and we have some journalists and other people who are saying, like you mentioned, reading scores are not where they should be.
Yeah.
And they're looking at reading instruction and saying, we're missing some really important pieces. And we knew about it back in 2000. And so a lot of times when they reference science of reading, they're talking about that report and the information that came out of that rigorous analysis of research to say good literacy development, learning how to read, needs these pieces. And so that's vocabulary and phonemic awareness and phonics and fluency and comprehension. And so we see those words a lot because those were kind of the main topics there in the science of reading. And so we're, since 2018, becoming a little more aware of that, oh yeah, we were missing some of these pieces, especially things like the phonics and the phonemic awareness. They found there were a lot of curricula that didn't include that or emphasize it in as intentional of a way as it should have. And so I think that's the yes part. Like, yes, we could be doing better. And we need to always be looking for ways to improve our instruction. The and part for me is that I think it's gotten so much attention. That's good. It got attention and it's improving the way that we teach. But I think then when we talk about our youngest learners, we're missing some pieces where we start with a lot of things, have these assumptions that if this is good for children, it's also good for younger children. It's good for 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 2-year-olds.
The research that the panel used was all K12.
It was
really
K12. And that's I feel like that is one of the key pieces that a lot of discussions are missing. The research focused on K12 and their findings, they mostly apply to K12 or K2 because they're primary as well. But many of those same people on that panel immediately there, in fact, I think it may be in the end of the summary of the report, essentially say, so now we need to go figure out what we know about preschoolers, right? That they acknowledge their own limitation, that this is K12 data that we're primarily using. And so some of those same panelist members were on a subsequent panel that looked specifically at early literacy. But today in 2023, when we talk about science of reading, almost always they're referencing that 2000 that looked at K12. And so that's one of the first pieces that I think is missing, is that, you know, sometimes we take, I think, and I'm trying to remember who it was, I was reading an article, it's cited in some of those resources on the podcast that you mentioned. But there was an academic on one of his papers, and he says, too often when we do a lot of research, the headlines are the only things that make it all the way, that we miss all the details, right? That the headlines are the only thing that have legs. And so with science of reading, I feel like we've got a lot of legs on this awareness of building phonics and some of these other intentional aspects that we need to teach more directly, more intentionally. But the part that was missing was that was intended for K through 2 or K through 12. And
on the topic of headlines, can I interrupt you for a minute? The topic of the headlines being the only part of the story they hear. Today in the Indianapolis Star, the headline was Indiana's largest teachers colleges failing on teaching science of reading.
Right. And what's interesting is you may even be teaching some of those or very many of those. And it goes back and forth with how we start defining things. Are you teaching, many are teaching even the components, but they aren't teaching a specific thing that they use to measure. So too often what happens then is maybe states or other programs say science of reading is good. And so we're going to start with our 3-year-olds with science of reading, but the actual science, the research that then came out of that early literacy panel is slightly different. And subsequent research, there's been a collection of research. I think they put it out in 2021 that then looked at literally said, okay, we had this early literacy panel and that was 20 years ago. So what do we know since then? And that was put out just fairly recently, but doesn't get the headlines, doesn't get the attention. But it tells us that
just like early childhood,
right? And
the headlines and the attention.
And it tells us that for our earliest learners, it's not as simple as just pushing it down. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we're making in many areas, not just with literacy, is that we try to give our younger learners elementary school light,
Yeah.
right? That
Yeah.
we just give them,
If it's light. Yeah.
right? Or just elementary school, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the places that we're missing so many golden opportunities, because we think we're helping by giving them what they didn't need yet.
Mhm.
And anytime we push something down, we push something out,
Yeah.
and we're
Yeah.
missing what they really need.
And they're not quite ready for it. It's
Yeah.
not even, what are they missing? They're just sometimes not quite ready for it. There's a foundation that has to be built.
Yeah. And that's,
You did you shared a graphic of the 5 pillars of the science of reading, and then you sort of developed another graphic for what you think kind of the foundational pieces, or the and pieces
mhm.
that we need to think about when we're working with kids under 5 and younger.
Yeah. I'm a visual person. And so you see a lot of graphics out saying, the 5 pillars of reading, because these are the main 5 keys that come out of the science of reading. And those are good. But the yes, and is, what are they built on? What's the foundation? We don't just extend it further down in the ground. And so we know that the science, the research tells us that we have a broad experience with language and literacy that begins as soon as a child can hear and interact with other people, right? So we're building that foundation. And then we have this emergent literacy foundation that we're building that includes oral language and alphabet awareness. I mean, that's not in the 5 pillars, but you can't teach phonics if you don't have alphabet awareness. Or
Right.
concept of print is another one that's in that emergent foundational piece.
Mhm.
And then because I believe in holistic, this whole child approach, we also have to recognize that how we teach really matters.
Mhm.
And so I think we have to combine what we know about the science of reading with what we know about how children learn generally. And within that whole scope of all the other things that they are learning, so that as they're learning the science of reading, they're also building all these other aspects of their development, and those are all integrated together.
Right. And just as important,
Mhm.
they're more difficult to measure sometimes.
Yeah. Mhm.
So we don't value it.
Yeah. And yeah.
A lot. I think about so every state has their early learning standards, and Indiana has theirs called the foundations, which overall I like them. I think they're good and they're appropriate. But they're tailored to go right into the school standards, the K-12 standards. And because K-12 standards don't really cover physical development,
Right.
there's very limited foundations, or the foundations for that are really like hygiene and one thing that says fine and gross motor skills together.
Right.
And so we don't get as good guidance from those standards as we do from some of the other foundations. And I think that's just sort of an example of how we need to really be able to advocate for what children need in the early childhood years. And if we do that, they'll be ready for the stuff that's coming along later. But we think you talk about pushing kids down the stairs. Maybe this is a good time for me to ask you about that metaphor that you included in this blog.
Yeah. So years ago is when I wrote this piece called Developmentally Appropriate Practice and Why We Don't Push Kids Down the Stairs.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I linked it with the reading one, because it's so connected. Just this idea that we know that children can't walk down the stairs in an alternating one foot on one step, the next foot on the next step, until they're about 3 or 4 years old. We've got toddlers that are backing down the stairs, or we have the step together as they cling to the side. It just takes time. It takes time for some physical maturation to happen. They need that center of gravity to shift and their legs to be longer. It takes time for some brain maturation to happen so that those hemispheres can communicate in a cohesive way. And it takes experience. They need that practice going up and down the stairs. And generally, as a society, we're okay with that it takes a while. We don't seem to worry about getting children to go down the stairs in that alternating fashion a little bit sooner, or try to get them ahead a little bit. We're not selling programs or flashcards on how to get ahead on that.
Yeah, parents aren't asking each other about that at
Exactly. Yeah. And we would never push them to do it before they're ready. The idea of pushing them to go down the stairs, it makes people cringe, and it should. That's part of why I used that title. It makes people uncomfortable. It makes us uncomfortable to think about pushing kids to go down the stairs before they're ready. But there's so many other areas where we're pushing children to do things before they're ready to do it. And and in some cases, it's also causing more damage than good, just like it would if we were to push them to go down the stairs. And So yeah, recognizing that when we push them before they're developmentally ready, we're not doing them any favors. Too often we're more interested in seeing what we want to see, and maybe not even intentionally. I think sometimes even with the best of intentions, we are setting them up to show us what we want to see more so than we're concerned with giving them what they need in that period. We kind of have this, I think it's too tempting to design things top down, but development happens bottom up. And so we have to meet them where they are.
Yeah. Yeah. And, again, I guess there's just so much more value put on what children can do academically. Even when I mentioned parents a minute ago, I'm not criticizing parents for asking each other those questions.
Right.
That's what they've been programmed and taught and marketed to do. And they're doing that to advocate for their own child's, success. But as professionals, we have a higher standard of understanding what exactly is valuable about or emerging literacy in these earlier years. It's not just letters. It's not just alphabet recognition and using big words or whatever.
Yeah.
Those
making all the right sounds.
Part of it, yeah.
Yeah.
But there's so much more that you kind of have to seek out to learn about yourself so that you can do it, support it with young children. There was a reason for all that, but it's gone. So I want to go back. So you have we've talked about the 5 pillars, and I want to go back and read them. The 5 pillars of science of reading that came from that panel: vocabulary, phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, comprehension. I don't think anyone's going to stand up and say, yeah, none of those matter. I don't want to do any of those things. They're solid things. That's
absolutely.
But when you add in, you talk about the precursors of those pillars, the things you just were sort of talking about. Let me find those too, so you don't have to rely on your memory. But the foundational language and literacy experiences you talked about. Alphabet knowledge, phonological awareness, concepts of print. You also include writing in what should be considered a precursor, or what you consider to have been sort of left out of the science of reading conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting. So if you go back to that panel in 2000, they discussed a lot of topics that they might look at, and then they had to narrow it down. That's part of keeping it very rigorous and making it good science. But in that conversation, writing was discussed, and then they took it out. So I think that's another place where I would say we have to be careful, because kind of what you were saying, we value what we measure, but that doesn't mean that only the things we measure matter.
Right.
And so they didn't include writing because they found either they didn't have enough studies to look at to do it correctly, or for whatever reasons they had in their discussion. But if you go to some of these pieces that give us research about early literacy, writing comes up quite a bit. And I can see that especially with emergent literacy, the way that writing works together with concepts of print, understanding how print works, or with inventive spelling, that's then connected to some concepts about phonics, really, and how letters work and what sounds they make. And there are a lot of concepts put together as we give children these emergent writing experiences that are supported by the research.
Yeah. Have you seen I love invented writing. But there's a new one that's been going all over
I think
media, the certificate one.
There's
a very, very creative invention of the kit part.
Right. They're making all the sounds. They're getting all the sounds in there, right?
It's really brilliant when you look at it. I think you talked a minute ago about how we need to think about the whole child too. Well, a few minutes ago. And when we're talking about writing, one of my favorite things is to tell somebody, some unsuspecting buddy, that climbing up the slide is literacy. But that's, when we're talking about writing, I think it's important for that to be part of this conversation too, because otherwise, if we don't think deeply or understand the precursors, we think name writing is what's important. Or just random letters on a line on that lined paper. But if we think about the physical stuff that needs to be in place for a child to be successful using that tool in that coordinated way, physical big body play becomes really important.
Yeah. I was struck once. I think sometimes we make assumptions based on what we know and we forget
Yeah.
where we need to start to help
Yeah.
other people understand. And I was in a training, I was teaching a training, and I just made a comment that I thought was obvious, said something like, if we have children who are struggling with writing, the best thing we can do for them is not to just put them in front of more and more pieces of paper and do more and more writing.
Mhm.
And it struck me that I had all these eyes looking back at me saying, well, then what else do we do? In fact, I think someone asked. And so we had conversations about all the things we need to do if a child is struggling with writing, it's not just about forming letters, that they're building fine motor skills and big body things. Like you said, all the physical development that it takes to sit in a chair at a table and put your arm up and hold a pencil and start before you even make a mark on that page. There are so many other experiences that child is relying on to have those physical abilities.
Their shoulders have to be strong. It's not just fingers even.
It's
and
I
used to stand in front of groups and say, gross motor is the whole body, and then fine motor is like this, the fingers. And what's wrong with that? Now I know better. Children develop from the outside or from the inside out, right? That'll be more meaningful in the video version of this, but so they've got to have a good, strong, healthy core. Well, I don't want to say healthy, but a good experience with their core body strength and muscles, and then it extends out shoulders, elbows, wrists, and that's all pre-literacy.
Those things, like you said, climbing up the stairs climbing up the slide or going across the monkey bars, digging in the sandbox, all of those things are helping to prepare them, give them the skills and the strength. Play-Doh for sure. And so when we start seeing all of those things as writing, it shifts the way we look at that we're doing that preparation work.
And makes it a little easier to advocate for play.
Right. Absolutely.
I'm just looking through the things I circled and underlined here. So I'm not sure if this will work in an audio format, but you talk about, and I had never heard of this before, Hollis Scarborough's reading rope. Feel like you can talk that through without peeing?
I think so. And there's some links in that blog post. I love listening to her explain it. But I think one of the general takeaways is understanding that building literacy has many, many different skills. And she talks about them being woven together like a rope, and that you have all these strands that are weaving together because you need them all. They work together, but you're also increasing in that strength. They rely on each other. They strengthen each other. And but there are kind of these two aspects of there's the sounds, the phonics aspects, recognizing letters and making the sounds and decoding those aspects. But that's not enough. And sometimes I see programs that are geared, especially towards really young children, where they're just training them to make sounds. And that's like taking just a few strands out of this rope and hoping that's going to be strong enough. But there's this other part that is all of the meaning. So that's all the oral language and vocabulary and these conversations and songs and stories and the read alouds where you're having conversations back and forth. That's a critical part as well that's woven in here. And that when you take all of these skills together and weave them together, those are our strong readers. But you can't just pull one skill out of isolation and pretend that is itself reading. Just making the sounds on the page, that is not reading.
You say making meaning is the ultimate goal of reading.
Ultimately.
And writing I would include in there. It reminded me of, this is going back to writing again, but I think it's still relevant, of a boy I had in one of my classes who was 4, and mom called me and was really worried. Well, first she took him out of my program because she didn't like something. But then she called me like 6 months later because he wouldn't sit and do name writing practice. And she was really distressed, like, really just feeling like he's going to be so behind. And I said, well, the biggest thing you can do is make him, provide experience that make him want to write or see the value of writing. So, of course, build up that strength if that's what you see is missing, but also if he just sees it as a chore that he's not good at, that you're really
that means nothing.
That means nothing to him. Then of course he's not going to want to sit and do like drills essentially. But if writing becomes something he sees as a useful tool to convey meaning or to, read and receive meaning, and it's something that's relevant to him, then he's going to be a whole lot more motivated to to want to write, but
Mm-hmm.
then, then is he ready to write? The physical
Right.
readiness comes into the conversation, but I think that all sort of fits into this idea of there being a rope with many strands.
Mm-hmm. It's also interesting in the context, when I start nerding out and I dig around and where are the footnotes and what else does it go to? What's the context? And so when this national reading panel was convened and they released their results in 2000, there was actually another panel that got together. I should find what the actual name is. They were doing a similar piece of work, but theirs was more like a synthesis of, so it was the preventing reading difficulties in young children. So that one was published in 1998, and where the National Reading Panel report was more of a meta-analysis. It was really rigorous science.
Mm-hmm.
The other panel was doing more of a synthesis. They brought together, from all their different disciplines, what they knew about what needed to be done to prevent reading difficulties. So they came out with some answers that were very similar, some that were different. But those are some of the things that I feel like got left out, just what you're describing. They talk some about motivation and environment and some of those other aspects. So it goes back again, like we were saying with, if we only count what we measured or can easily measure, we may leave out some other things that do matter that are harder to measure. And that motivation piece is part of that. Making it meaningful can be part of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Or waiting until it's meaningful. Sometimes it's not it's not necessarily us putting a lot of effort into making it. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's just sort of that maturation.
Both sides of that.
Yeah. Which brings me to the book that you made me order. Boo-hoo, I had to buy another book. Proust and the Squid. The Science of the Reading Brain by cognitive neuroscientist Marianne Wolf. I'm really excited for it to get to my house. But you shared that she wrote, the association between hearing written language and feeling loved, I'm going to choke up a little, provides the best foundation for this long process of emergent literacy, and no cognitive scientist or educational researcher could have designed a better one. Just that idea that connecting hearing that language and feeling loved. We talk about, we want it to be an enjoyable experience. We want children to have positive experiences with books, and your lap is the best place, all those things. But that, I don't know, there's something about sticking the word love in there.
Right. And I think sometimes we're hesitant to use that from a science, love isn't science, love isn't nerdy, but there's actually a lot of really fascinating science about what emotion does to the brain and how it changes the way that the brain is open to learning and prepared for learning. And especially when we're talking about human development, there are so many research-based pieces of information that we know that relationships matter. I say all the time that all of human development happens in the context of human relationships, because we see it over and over in the research that relationships, it's this thread that runs through human development, and it connects with, especially with early learning, that we can't, again, maybe put this, it's harder to measure, but we have some neuroscientists who have done it, and they've shown us that relationships and emotion, it actually absolutely plays into how our little ones learn.
Yeah, it's so hard to, I think there's resistance to it, to talking about love and using that kind of blatant language about relationships, even though we'll talk all day about how relationships matter and are important. Part of it, I think, is because, we're just so used to fighting for respect as experts and professionals. And if we throw love and emotion into it, we're going to take 3 steps backwards.
Right.
So that's one of the reasons I love that all this good nerdy neuroscience stuff is coming out.
I love to use quotes that use words like love and joy when I'm quoting neuroscientists. That's my favorite time to use those words, because then it's not me saying it, even though I want to say it as well. But I feel like when I have a neuroscientist saying it or a cognitive scientist saying it, then we know that this word love is backed by a bunch of footnotes with research, right?
Yep. I love it. Because that'll hit for somebody. Somebody needs that connection for it to really stick. Please hold my underlinings. I think we've hit everything that I wanted to specifically ask. What would you add? What have we not? What did you want to say before?
The only thing that I've thought of is when I've talked with other teachers who are in similar positions where they're saying, I teach pre-K, or I teach 3-year-old preschoolers. But my school district or my state is saying it's all science of reading. And they just want to take it and push it down and water it down. What I've told them, I think some of the best things to bring to those conversations, if you're headed to meetings or trainings and conversations, is to bring research, right? If we're talking about the science of reading, then bring the science. And so there are other pieces of research in addition to that national reading panel. So one I would bring is the report of the National Early Literacy Panel that was in 2008 that followed that. I mean, that some of these same researchers said, now we need to look at the younger learners. And that's the report they released in 2008. And then I would bring Effectiveness of Early Literacy Instruction, 20 Years of Research. That one was published in 2021. That again is going to take more science that is focusing more so on our youngest learners. And so just making sure that, I think if you show up to a meeting and say, I don't like science of reading, that's not going to help anybody. But if you show up and say, I am so excited about all these new things that we're learning and better articulating, I want to make sure that we're actually also including the research focused on 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and be prepared with some of that research to bring in, because it is very similar, but we owe it to our youngest learners to look at the research that was focused on them to make sure that we're getting it right and that we're not just trying to resize something for them.
Yeah. And for our professional respect, right? If we are concerned about being considered professionals with valuable expertise, let's learn the right stuff, let's learn the stuff that's relevant to the age that we're working with and be able to be part of those conversations in that way. Because I'll tell you what, when the first conversations we were having about this in Indiana that I was part of, I was feeling sick to my stomach. Like I was so nervous. And then I was like, oh wait, this is just the 2000 reading panel. All right.
Right. And it's really, and so much of it is how it gets interpreted, right? With anything in education, we have some really great ideas that get interpreted really poorly. And so I think that's our job as professionals, to make sure that it's being interpreted correctly for our youngest learners, and to come with, I say over and over, people don't value what they don't understand. And so if you feel like you're not being valued at the table, or your preschoolers aren't being valued, then it's my job to figure out, what do people not understand about my work or about my children? And so in this conversation, I think one of those big pieces is, what do they not understand about how our 3 and 4-year-olds are different than our K through 2-year-olds? And how can I add that so that they will value that difference?
Yeah, that's great. Sorry, I'm hot flashing while we're recording. I'm like looking at how flushed I am on the camera. It's that time for Heather. Anyway, so Amanda, this has been really, really great. I've really enjoyed it. How can people find you, and what is out there for them to find? Like what?
So you can find me at notjustcute.com. And then I have a podcast called Not Just Cute, the podcast. I do have Instagram. I don't post as often as some may say that I should, but that's Amanda_NotJustCute. You can find me there as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm on Instagram too. And I mean, personally, I use it a lot, but for my nerd stuff, it doesn't really fit the kinds of things I share.
There's only so much one person can do, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah. All right. Thanks very much. I'm going to try and remember to include links to those 2 important resources that you shared when this goes out. And I'm sure folks, a lot of them already know you, I'm sure, who are listening to this, but if it's their first time, I know they're going to have a lot of fun over there looking at all your.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, thanks again. And thanks everybody for listening to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd.